current day bottles from even 3 years ago doubled in price today. So it's very, very possible that if you select the right bottles, it's still a very good investment tool at many levels.
Yeah, I think we're fortunate that there's quite a lot of good knowledge.
So then what's the future of whiskey collecting? Do you see the prices changing the way people collect? Do you see any influence of things like climate change or economic forces on the market?
I think where we're headed is it's going to be a scenario where we have escalating prices still for the really, really rare bottles, the top 1%. I think the future would bring on new competitors for whiskey. For example, rum. That's really come up in the last couple of years. Old and antique rum as well. You can kind of see the spillover effect of people collecting spirits and whiskey. There's even now in the last year that I've noticed old and rare grappa, stuff that we probably never think of 5 years ago. In terms of whiskey, going back to whiskey, I think in terms of whiskey, we still have many fairs around the world, whiskey fairs around the world, where signs are still encouraging. I see a lot of collectors willing to open really old bottles from their collections and share them with the public for a price. But I think people are starting to warm up to and understand that they're paying for that experience, and they're which is hard to be replaced, because I think a lot of the older bottles today, once drunk, will probably never be opened. Once that sort of starts to die down, then people would start looking for the Serge calls them alternatives. Hopefully, there's still a lot to drink in the world. I mean, that's the positive that I take away.
That's very good news. But if it means that people are going to open up their collections, does that tell you that there will still be rare bottles out there? We're not at risk of running out of these old bottles?
I think we'll run out someday, because some of these bottles, for example, those on top, it's 250 bottles, bottled in the 1980s, 1990s. I won't know what will happen in maybe 5-10 years, but at least for now, I think the future's still bright. Yeah.
So could you buy a bottle today, what we might think of as a fairly standard bottle, and hang on to it for 20 to 30 years and see it appreciate?
Oh, absolutely. I think so. I think there's distilleries out there that are still, family owned, for example, like Springbank, or still using very, very similar production methods to how they've always been making certain whiskeys. Of course, we understand that distilleries don't have access to the same quality of casks as they did back in the 60s, 70s, or 80s.
Oh, I see. The casks are not as good as they used to be.
Correct.
Why is that?
I think with the advent of just, for example, having, for example, if you take sherry casks, back in the day, they had access to some of the best sherry casks because sherry was popular at the time, and sherry was still being made in decent quantities back in the early days. But today, sherry production has almost ceased, and whatever sherry they're making today goes into, for example, balsamico, sherry, vinegar, for example. So they don't have the sort of demand for them to make sherry at those quantities, and hence those casks, which are so treasured and so good in terms of the quality, are not accessible anymore. So and in terms of production methods as well, a lot of distilleries have sort of modernized their production methods. I can't necessarily I don't want to name any particular distilleries, but there are distilleries out there that have sort of like taken shortcuts because of more commercial reasons, where they want to produce more for less money.
Right.
Yeah. So
different methods, but there are still, as you say, still distillers using old methods where the quality is still going to be good and would hold up for a long time.
So to go back to your question, I think there are distilleries like Springbank which still make fantastic whiskey. If you were to buy Springbank today, go out and buy some good quality bottles from today, if you did your own research, definitely I think if you triangulate the quantity in terms of cask strength and non-cask strength, and you select the right bottles to buy, the bottles will also keep increasing in price. I've seen current day bottles from even 3 years ago double in price today. So it's very, very possible that if you select the right bottles, it's still a very good investment tool at many levels. Yeah.
So it comes down to finding the right quality, and then, as you said, studying to see what the methods are and where there might be kind of a demand in the market.
Correct. If you look at other distilleries like, for example, Ardbeg, they're still producing great whiskey today. I think if you look at the modern whiskeys, a lot of times the alcohol in the spirit's really it's really high, and most times when you open a bottle of new Lafroig or a new bottle of Ardbeg, you're almost struggling with the alcohol, where it's really high. But over time, 20, 30 years, the spirit mellows, and a lot more of the flavor comes out of the whiskey, and so the whiskey itself, at least in my opinion, actually gets better over time. And when, in 20 or 30 years, when the limited production runs of today are no longer available, naturally the prices and the scarcity goes up.
So it's not just fine wine that gets better with age, but fine whiskey can also really mellow.
Oh, completely. And whiskey is also easier to keep. I think at a minimum of 40% proof and up, 40% alcohol and up, it's easy. It doesn't go bad. So that makes it appealing, investment as well. You don't have to refrigerate it or put the bottles on the side. So it does need to be kept out of sunlight. Sunlight's kind of the major enemy of whiskey.
But overall, less trouble to keep than
less
wine.
trouble. Yeah. Easier to display, easier to store, for example. So I think it's also slightly different from wine, where if you open a bottle of wine, you kind of have to finish it within a few days or on the spot. But for whiskey, you could open a bottle, drink half of it, and leave the bottle for 3 years, and it'll still be just as good. Yeah.